We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Jen Marlowe. Jen Marlowe is a Seattle-based author, documentary filmmaker, playwright, and human rights advocate. Her writings have appeared in The Nation, TomDispatch.com, and CommonDreams.org. And she is the author of two books. First, Darfur Diaries, Stories of Survival. And here to talk about her newest book that she co-authored with Sami Al Jundi, The Hour of Sunlight, One Palestinian's Journey from Prisoner to Peacemaker. So start out, tell us, what was your motivation in writing your book, The Hour of Sunlight?
Well, the motivation really started with my relationship with Sami Al Jundi, my co-author, who the book is also about. And I've known Sami since 1999. We worked together in an Israeli-Palestinian peace dialogue organization in Jerusalem. And my colleagues and I would spend hours and hours with Sami riding around the country in his Ford Transit as we were picking up Israeli and Palestinian kids for meetings and activities. And we would hear bits and pieces of his life story as we were driving around the country. Incredible stories of growing up in the old city of Jerusalem, one of 12 children to two blind parents. Stories of his 10 years as a prisoner in Israeli prison for having been a militant, involved in militant anti-occupation activities as a teenager. Stories of trying to adjust back to life after prison. And every time we would hear these stories, my colleagues and I would always say, Sami, you should write a book. These are incredible stories. And he would always dismiss us. And he would say, oh, my life's not that interesting. There's nothing here to write about. I don't know what you're talking about. And then the organization that Sami and I worked for, we both met a very disappointing end with the organization. And actually, in Sami's case, I think it went further than that. And he was really treated with incredible disrespect and experienced a lot of humiliation, a real betrayal, I would say. And during that time period, I was talking to him a lot, trying to keep his spirits up and support him. And in one of those conversations, he said, Jen, that book that you and everyone else has kept telling me that I should write, I think I'm ready now. I'd like to write that book. And we talked about it on the phone for a while, and by the end of the conversation, we had agreed that I would come to Jerusalem the next month and that I would work with him on telling his story and on him writing his story. And at the time that I asked him if he wanted my help doing that, at the time it was my way to give something to Sami. He was someone who I loved like a brother, who was in great pain, and I knew that this book would give him something to hold his head up about and feel proud about during a time when he was in a lot of pain and had undergone severe humiliation. So that was my initial motivation, but as I began working on the project with him, I became incredibly passionate about it for its own reasons. And I think it's a combination of two reasons, and one is that so many aspects of Sami's life story are really a microcosm of the larger Palestinian narrative. His tale, in many ways, is a quintessential Palestinian narrative. Everything from his parents being refugees from 1948, their villages being destroyed in 1948. Sami's own earliest memories are fleeing his home under attack in the old city of Jerusalem during the War of 1967, coming back to his home after the war, only then to be expelled by Israeli soldiers who had newly occupied East Jerusalem. He and his family kicked out of his home because that neighborhood was being razed and rebuilt now for Israeli inhabitants. His involvement in, his growing, political involvement as a teenager, which led to his decision to become a fighter. His years in prison, so many of those things represent stories which are very common to the Palestinian experience, except they're very unknown here in this country. The Palestinian narrative is not one that we have a lot of access to. Our government has a very close relationship with Israel. We've got much more exposure to the Israeli narrative. I think mainstream Americans grow up with Holocaust stories, with Anne Frank, with Exodus, Leon Uris's book Exodus. All those things sort of shape our view of, even without realizing it, those are kind of the fiber of the story that we know in this country. So I thought I think it's very important. Anyone who cares about peace with justice in that part of the world has to understand the Palestinian narrative. And combined with that is Sami's own extraordinary takeaway that Sami took from his own life. I mean, coming out of prison with a resolve from that point on to work only nonviolently for freedom and for the end of occupation, and to work jointly with Jewish Israelis. Sami believes with his heart and soul that the only way forward is cultivating a joint vision for peace with justice and equality, Palestinians and Israelis together. So he's he's a very extraordinary human being. So it was that combination of this quintessential narrative in some respects, and this absolutely extraordinary human being, and his worldview.
So talk about the circumstances that landed him in prison in the first place.
Well, when East Jerusalem became occupied in 1967, and that was when Sami was a 5-year-old boy. So throughout Sami's childhood, he was becoming growingly aware of what that meant to grow up under occupation. And as he describes it, occupation infiltrated into every aspect of his life, into his freedom of movement, into his education, seeing people he knew be killed at demonstrations that were happening in the Old City in Jerusalem. I mean, it was impacting him more and more, and he and his friends decided that the only way they could think of to stand up, to resist, to fight for his people's freedom and dignity was to become a fighter. So that's the choice that they made. Sami was 17 when he made that choice. When he was 18, he and his friends were building a bomb in Sami's bedroom. And it's very important for Sami to make this distinction that the bomb was to be used against Israeli police. There was never any intention to target civilians, and that was a decision that he and the other boys had made. They did not want to target civilians. But the bomb they were building exploded prematurely, and it was in Sami's bedroom. One of his friends, a boy named Badawi, was killed instantly when that happened. He and his other friend, whose name was Abbas, were seriously injured. And then, of course, immediately arrested, interrogated, tortured. Sami experienced some pretty intense torture during the interrogation, and Sami ultimately was sentenced to 10 years in Israeli prison.
And what did he find when he arrived at prison?
Well, what he found in prison was an extraordinary community of other Palestinian political activists who had really built a thriving prison society in these very harsh conditions of incarceration. And he became, the newest member of this incredibly democratic community that was all based on principles of trust and solidarity. He was put in a cell with other new prisoners. There was 2 older prisoners that were their instructors, and he spent the first 3 years of his incarceration in an education program that was entirely designed and run by the prisoners themselves. So he and his fellow prisoners would sit, and his fellow cellmates would sit in a circle all day on the concrete floor, discussing the books that they were reading. They were given assigned reading. He spent years and years reading about war, reading about peace, combined with literature, reading about economics, philosophy. Much of that was structured in the official education program that the prisoners had built. And then once they passed out of those courses, he and his cellmates could choose to design elective courses. They could decide that they wanted to focus on economics, and they could create an elective course on economics. Every aspect of prison life, every aspect that wasn't regulated by the Israeli guards, was regulated by the prisoners themselves in these systems of self-governance with elections and committees. Sami's cell served as the news committee for a period of time, and what that meant was that his cell had the contraband radio. And late at night, he and his cellmates would listen to the radio very quietly. They would write down the headlines on a piece of paper. In the morning, the janitor, who was a fellow prisoner, would go from cell to cell in the section and slip the piece of paper into each cell, one cell at a time, for the other prisoners to read. And that was how the prisoners learned what was going on in the outside world. So they had incredibly ingenious ways of coping with their incarceration, but it was all built on this community that was founded on trust, equality, solidarity, and democracy, which is incredible and really anti-intuitive of what we think of when we think of prison societies.
And this was an Israeli-run prison?
Yep, it was. He was in a few different prisons. The first prison he was in the Israeli town of Beersheba, and then after 4 years there, he was transferred to Ashkelon. So these were prisons inside Israel, run by the Israeli prison system, but all the internal workings, the Palestinian prisoners themselves took charge of in this democratic way.
And I have to imagine the Israelis knew about this, that the Palestinians had this infrastructure that was teaching them these democratic processes.
Yeah, and Sammy also talked about the ways that the prisoners, what the prisoners had to do to obtain some of those rights and privileges. And there was a lot of different forms of resistance, many in the form of hunger strikes. And even before Sammy had entered the prison system, he described, in the late 70s, huge hunger strikes and huge acts of resistance that the older prisoners had undertaken in order to be able to have the rights to read, have the rights to pen and paper, things like that. Prisoners had died during those hunger strikes. There had been prisoners that had been essentially beaten to death during those hunger strikes. So the prisoners themselves had paid a very heavy price in order to be able to create this society. And Sammy said that, in large part, as long as the prisoners weren't creating problems for the guards weren't interested in creating problems for the prisoners. And there was this very, at times very tense, at times uneasy, at times explosive, but this very symbiotic relationship between the prisoners and the guards.
Talk more about the structure within the prison. There were committees that one could you join whichever committee you wanted, or was it kind of set out for you?
Sammy, the committee that Sammy was most proud to serve on was the Education Committee. And in order to join the Education Committee, he had to have passed out of all 4 levels of courses. And he said with pride that, he was one of only, I don't remember what the number of prisoners was, how many prisoners had actually passed through all 4 levels of courses. But that in itself was somewhat of an elite group of prisoners, and that was a prerequisite to be able to be a part of the Education Committee. And then Sammy was also part of the Magazine Committee. There was an Internal Security Committee, and I believe prisoners were invited to serve on that committee. But the committee chairs there was a sort of a 3-part election process. So there would be a wider prison council that was elected every 6 months, and that was elected from a list of all 500 prisoners. You would choose the 15 you wanted to serve in this wider council from all 500. From that wider council, it was narrowed down to a smaller council of about 12 prisoners, and that was selected from those 15. And then from those 12, 5 were selected to be in charge of the main, the big Uber committees, I guess you could say. And so out of those 5, 1 would be the prisoner that was representing all of the prison. 1 was in charge of the security committee, 1 was in charge of intra-prisoner affairs, 1 was in charge of communication with the Israelis. And then that leadership also reflected itself in the different levels of the prison. So there, for example, there'd be 1 prisoner from the entire prison that would be the one who was able to communicate with the Israeli guards on matters that concerned the whole prison. But the prison was divided into different sections. So each section also had their appointed liaison, who would be the person to deal with the Israeli guards if it was a matter that concerned the section. Then within each cell, which had generally about, the cell sizes changed depending on which prison, but generally about 8-person cell. So each cell had a liaison to deal with the Israeli guard for matters that involved just the cell. So it was a very, very intricate system. And every 6 months there was new elections and new opportunities for prisoners to be involved in the different aspects of the organization. And Sammy talks about his own proudest moment actually being when he was appointed to teach the new prisoner course, because his experiences of being in the new prisoner course and the way he felt about the 2 older prisoners that were teaching him and his other cellmates. I mean, he recognized that they were viewing as their primary task was to build the humanity of the younger prisoners. And when Sammy had finally graduated to the point where he was considered an old prisoner, and then was asked to be the person shaping and guiding and leading the course for the new prisoners, he took that as really almost a sacred responsibility, that it was now his turn to, as he phrased it, their responsibility was to build each other as human beings.
And when approximately did he have the realization that doing things like making bombs wasn't the route to take?
There wasn't one turning point. There wasn't one aha moment where he woke up and said, oh, I'm going to follow a path of nonviolence now and reconciliation. But the process absolutely began in prison. And it began both in that experience of that prison society and also in the reading he did. Sammy spent 10 years deeply, deeply immersed in books. And in that reading, he encountered writings of Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, of Gandhi. And there was one anecdote that he read, one story about Gandhi that really moved him in particular. And it's the story where a Hindu man murders a Muslim baby and comes to Gandhi repentant with blood on his hands and asks, what is he to do? Expecting Gandhi is going to say he should be put to death. And Gandhi told him that he needed to find a Muslim orphan and raise him as his own for 20 years, providing this child with love and an Islamic education. And Sammy reflected profoundly on that anecdote, this idea that it took 20 years to build a soul, 20 years to build this human being, but yet the murder of the baby that had instigated that incident happened in a matter of seconds. And that story influenced him deeply. And there was a lot that he read in prison that was sort of tucked away in the corners of his mind. He didn't have the language or the vocabulary of nonviolence yet in which to process everything he was reading. But after he got out of prison, he ended up stumbling into a place called the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence, which was founded by Mubarak Awad. And as he began to get involved in the activities there and began to read the writings of Mubarak Awad, which had laid out a real strategic plan of using nonviolence as a way to confront the brutality of the occupation, he began to feel with excitement all these hidden corners in his brain of so many things he had read in prison beginning to open and beginning to make these connections between thinking and pondering he'd done in prison with this new language and vocabulary and philosophy of nonviolence that he was encountering. And he immediately embraced the activities of the Center for Nonviolence, ended up working with them for a number of years, and then ended up taking it even steps further and working directly with Jewish Israelis in partnership, both in direct action activities and also in dialogue-based programs.
I've seen on posts some of the reading lists from the library there in prison, and it's incredibly extensive. Much more than I ever experienced through our public schools.
And that's actually a very partial list. At the end of the book, The Hour of Sunlight, we have an appendix of, a partial list of Sammy's prison reading list. And I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg of what he actually ended up reading. And, there have been times where I've said, okay, I want to just, hole myself up somewhere for several years with nothing but the books on Sammy's reading list, and sit and work my way through every single one of them. Sammy, who never officially graduated from high school, is probably the best read person I know, and is able to draw from, that incredibly rich resource in everything he talks about and everything he does and his own personal philosophies. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible. He talked about books expanding his world far beyond the prison walls. He says at times prison felt smaller than a coffee cup, being contained inside a coffee cup, and at times it was limitless because through books you could travel anywhere, you could talk to anyone, you could experience anything. So
can you mention a few of those books for people that haven't seen the list?
Oh, wow. I wish I had the list in front of me. It ranges from Greek classics, Homer. He read the complete works of Dostoevsky twice. He really delved into Soviet and post-Soviet writers. Makarenko's poem was something that influenced him greatly. Persian philosophies, Mani and Mazdak, and then, of course, political tracts. He would read political books about the conflict, both by Arab writers, Palestinian writers, also Israeli writers. I mean, there was a real intention to get a multiplicity of perspectives on all the different issues he was reading about. So And he did a lot of reading, politics, history, but it was always literature that moved Sammy's soul the most. So he would follow up, an intense book the Palestinian issue and its projects for resolution, which I think is by Mahdi Abdul Hadi, and so he would follow that up with How the Steel Was Tempered, which is a Russian novel, I think, by Ivan Turgenev, and it was always literature that spoke most to Sammy's soul.
But they even had American writers like Mark Twain.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, he talks about how Huckleberry Finn influenced him, and how the story of how a black slave and a white boy breaking all the boundaries of racism and oppression in their society moved him. Gone with the Wind by Scarlett O'Hara. He read Martin Luther King. He was moved by he read Angela Davis, who was a leader in SNCC and Black Panther movement, and was very moved by the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Did a lot of reading about the U.S. Civil Rights Movement.
One of the things that he experienced there in prison were, criticism meetings. Criticism played a significant part in teaching them. Can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah,
and he describes the first criticism meeting, and he was really, he was a little bit nervous. It was his, first week in prison, and his cellmates were gathering in a circle in the evening, and he's like, what's going on? And one of his cellmates said, oh, it's the weekly criticism meeting. So he sort of steeled himself, bracing himself to be, scolded harshly for whatever he had done wrong. And that ended up being one of his favorite hours of the week every week, because he's sitting in the circle. How the meeting began first was his teacher in the cell, a fellow prisoner named Diab, started off by first criticizing himself. Diab first said, here's what I realize I did this week that, I should have done better. And then Diab went around to each person in the cell and first started with what they were doing well. First gave them positive reinforcement. And he would say, okay, Talal, you participated enthusiastically in all the discussions. You were really engaged when we were, dissecting about the Bolshevik Revolution. But when it was your turn to make tea and coffee for everyone in the cell, you forgot to do it. And one thing Sammy realized was that going around the circle, when each prisoner took responsibility for what they had done that was wrong, if they owned up to it themselves, if they took responsibility themselves, then no one else mentioned it. And that the emphasis was much more on encouraging them for what they were doing well, encouraging them for progress that they were making. And that was really when Sammy understood what I was mentioning before, that really this was about building them as human beings. And the feeling of being a part of a family, that feeling was strongest for Sammy during those criticism meetings than in any other time of the week.
And decisions there, were they made, was it a democratic process or a collective process?
It would depend on what kind of decision. There were certainly certain prisoners that had responsibility for certain areas of decision making, but any large decisions that were undertaken, for example, if they were going to decide to take on a hunger strike, those decisions were made totally collectively and by consensus. It was not just the head of the prison or the small steering committee making that decision. The process was arrived at collectively through, series of discussions and deliberations. And the Israelis could never figure that out. The Israelis always believed that there had to be an organizer. They called them the warm heads, the people that they assumed were responsible for the resistance or for the action. So they were always trying to figure out who were the warm heads and figure out how to punish them, thinking that would break the strike or that would break the action. And Sammy said they could never understand that those kinds of big decisions, there were no warm heads. They were made collectively by all the prisoners.
So this seems to totally contradict the image one would have of, let's say, U.S. prisons, where they say, well, if you're not a criminal going in, you sure will be when you come out, because you're going to learn all these, bad things in prison, where this sounds like completely the opposite. And it comes from the prisoners, not from the people overseeing the prison, the Israelis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in the Israeli prisons, the criminals and the political prisoners were kept separately. So if there was someone who was in prison for, robbery or carjacking or criminally motivated murder. They were not a part of the program that I'm describing. This was specifically for the political prisoners, so people who were in prison for politically motivated acts, no matter what those acts were. And it had been earlier that the prisoners were all combined in one system, and the Israelis ended up separating them out because they realized that the political prisoners were politicizing the criminals. So there would be people who might have gotten arrested for carjacking and, then got released and ended up getting rearrested for having become then, involved in a resistance movement, and which had not, they had not been politically active at all previously. So at that point, the Israelis actually separated the criminals from the Palestinian political prisoners. And Sammy's talked about, and there were some points of contact, and some of the things that we're used to seeing in our own prison system of violence and drug use, and he said that that was taking place in the criminal prison population as opposed to the political prison population. But I don't have any direct experience with what that system was or what those circumstances really were.
That's interesting. So it sounds like the Israeli guards and hierarchy were kind of more afraid of people becoming politicized than of things going in the opposite direction, the political prisoners becoming criminalized. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And on the one hand, I think they were very afraid of the criminals becoming politicized. But on the other hand, according to Sammy, according to some of the guards that he knew and had the opportunity to talk with, they also had a lot of respect for the political prisoners, more so than for the criminals. And many of the guards were Druze, especially there was some time that Sammy spent in a prison in the north of Israel where there's a large Druze population. So Druze are Arabs, citizens of Israel, and they're among the few Arab citizens of Israel who actually serve in the Israeli army and often end up, the only job prospects they often end up happening is either as police or as prison guards. And he had some really complex relationship with some of his Druze jailers who would talk to him and tell them that they respected him, and they would engage in conversations, as if on an equal basis. But of course, one was the jailer and one was jailed. So there was a lot of complexity to those relationships.
Okay, and real quickly, where is Sammy today in all of this?
Sammy today, he still lives in the old city of Jerusalem with his wife and his 4 children, and it's an unresolved story. There's no quote unquote happy ending or ending to Sammy's story. He is working right now as a cashier in a bakery, and he is hoping to be able to do work that fits more with what he is able to contribute to the world in terms of his incredible passion and his and his deep belief in developing a nonviolent joint vision and joint work of Israelis and Palestinians together. He wanted to be here. He was supposed to be here with me as we do this book tour and as we talk about the book, but he has not been granted a visa. And he applied on March 30th, 2009. And he's been waiting since then. He hasn't been rejected, but he hasn't gotten it. And it's because, of course, of his prison record. So the fact that when he was 18 years old, he and his friends decided to become fighters and were arrested for trying to build a bomb, that ends up taking all priority as, rather than what Sammy has dedicated his life to in the 2 decades since he got out of prison, dedicated fully towards nonviolence, peaceful reconciliation, Palestinians and Israelis engaged, together in dialogue. That's less important, apparently, to the U.S. consulate than the action he did at the age of 18.
Well, with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks, Mike. It was great to be here.